Hello, my name is Jane. Welcome to Sleep Stories World. In 530 AD, an Irish monk climbed into a small leather boat and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. This is not legend. A modern explorer tested it. He built the same boat, used the same materials, and made the same crossing, and proved it could be done. Tonight, we follow St. Brendan's extraordinary journey, from the cliffs of Kerry, through icebergs, past an erupting volcano, across warm tropical seas, to the shores of the New World, nearly 1,000 years before Columbus. This is a true story of faith, courage, and one of the greatest voyages in human history, told slowly, gently, and in full, to carry you peacefully into the deepest sleep. Come aboard. But first, let's prepare your space for rest. Ensure you're somewhere comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything, your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, please do so now. When you're ready, lie down and let yourself settle into your bed. Feel the weight of your body being supported. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket as your body relaxes. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Your only task now is to be here, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose and exhale slowly through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, feeling your chest expand. Breathe out, feeling your body sink deeper into your bed. In and out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest. Now, imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, carrying with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your chest. As you breathe out, imagine it spreading gently through your upper body. Breathe in, and let the light expand through your shoulders, your arms, your back. Breathe out, and feel it filling your stomach, your neck, your head, every space within you glowing softly. If a thought comes by, acknowledge it like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream, and then let it drift away. There will be time for those thoughts later. Now is for rest. On your next breath in, let the warm light travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, your knees. Breathe out, and sense it flowing down to your ankles, to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Focus on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. If your mind wanders, simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey toward sleep. And now, let us begin. We are going somewhere very old this evening, somewhere wind-worn and green, somewhere at the very edge of the known world. And we are going to travel, slowly, peacefully, with a man who looked out across the Atlantic Ocean and decided, with extraordinary calm, that he would sail into it. But before we meet him, we must first understand the world he came from. Long before the age of great navies, long before maps covered the oceans with confident lines and named every shore, there was an island at the far western edge of Europe. A place of soft rain and shifting skies. A place where the land ends in cliffs, and beyond the cliffs there is only water, grey-green, vast, and full of possibility. Ireland. In the early centuries after Christ, while much of Europe was in turmoil, while Rome fell and kingdoms rose and crumbled and rose again, Ireland remained curiously apart from it all. Separated from the continent by sea, and from Britain by the Irish Sea, it had never been conquered by Rome. And because of that separation, something remarkable happened there. Christianity, which had spread through the Roman Empire and then found itself caught in the chaos of that empire's collapse, took root in Ireland with extraordinary depth and quietness. Monks came. Communities formed. And in those communities, on cliff tops, in river valleys, on small islands barely larger than a field, scholars prayed and read and copied texts and thought long, careful thoughts about God and the world. Ireland, in these centuries, became a lamp. While the light flickered elsewhere, it burned steadily here. And from Ireland, that light would eventually be carried back out into Britain, and into Europe, by monks and missionaries who crossed the sea in small boats, carrying their faith and their learning with them. It is from this world that our traveller comes. Into this lamplit, rain-soft, sea-edged world, sometime between 484 and 489 AD. The records from so long ago are never quite certain. A boy was born near Tralee, in what we now call County Kerry, on the southwestern coast of Ireland. Kerry is one of those places that seems almost designed to make a person feel the presence of something larger than themselves. The mountains come down steeply to the sea there. The light changes constantly, gold one moment, silver the next. And the ocean stretches away to the west with nothing between you and the horizon for thousands of miles. The boy was given the name Brendan. We do not know very much about his earliest years. He came from a time before the keeping of careful records, but tradition tells us that as a young child, he was placed in the care of a remarkable woman. Her name was Itar, and she was the abbess of a small religious community near the River Meg in Limerick. Saint Itar, as she would later be known, ran a school for boys alongside her community of women. She was, by all accounts, a person of great gentleness and great intelligence, and it is said that she raised young Brendan with both. Imagine him there, in those early years. A child growing up among prayers and stories, learning Latin, learning to read, learning to listen to the long silences between words. The green countryside of Limerick spread around him, the slow river, the sound of chanting rising in the early morning air. He would have been a quiet, watchful sort of child, perhaps, the kind who notices things. When he was old enough, Brendan moved on, as young scholars did in those days, to study under another great teacher. His name was Jarlath, the abbot of Tuam, in what is now County Galway. And under Jarlath's guidance, Brendan grew into a man of learning, of faith, and of unusual determination. He would eventually become a monk. He would found monasteries. He would become one of the great spiritual figures of early medieval Ireland, celebrated, even in his own lifetime, as a man whose prayers had power, whose leadership inspired others, and whose hunger for God took him to the very edges of the earth. But that story, the extraordinary, astonishing story of the voyage, belongs to the early 530s AD, when Brendan was already a man in his 40s, already known, already respected, already a builder of communities. What drove him to the sea, we will come to in time. For now, rest in the thought of that world. The monasteries quiet in the evening light. The scribes bent over their manuscripts. The smell of tallow candles and damp stone. And somewhere in Kerry, a man standing at the cliff's edge, looking west. Now, here is something worth sitting with as you drift tonight. The story of Brendan's voyage, the extraordinary, improbable, wonderful story, was not written down at first. For generations, it lived in the air. It was spoken, told by monks to novices, carried by missionaries from Ireland to Scotland, from Scotland to the continent, passed between pilgrims on the road, between sailors at harbour, between abbots at their fireside on winter evenings. In this way, it was not so different from the great stories of ancient Greece, the tales attributed to Homer, of Odysseus sailing through unknown seas, meeting monsters and gods and islands of enchantment. Those stories, too, began as spoken things. They lived in memory and voice for centuries before anyone fixed them onto a page. The story of Brendan's voyage lived the same way. And as it was told and retold, as voices carried it across the decades and the centuries, the story breathed and shifted and grew. New details gathered around it, the way barnacles gather on the hull of a long-traveled ship. The facts of the voyage, and there were facts, became woven together with wonder, with mystery, with the particular magic that accumulates around any story that has been loved for a very long time. This is not a flaw. It is, in its way, one of the most human things imaginable. That a people who loved a story would keep it alive, would add their own understanding to it, would make it more than just an account. They would make it a work of meaning. Eventually, as monasteries across Ireland and Britain became extraordinary centres of manuscript culture, places where monks spent their lives carefully copying text after text onto vellum, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world, the stories of Brendan's voyage began to be written down. The earliest written references are tantalizing and brief. An Irish monk and geographer named Dykwill, writing around 825 AD, produced a work called Liber de Mensura Orbis Terrae, the Book of the Measurement of the World. In it, he describes islands far to the north of Britain, islands that had been visited by Irish monks, islands where the summer light was so extraordinary that a man could pick lice from his shirt at midnight. These are almost certainly the Faroe Islands, and possibly Iceland. And Dykwill's matter-of-fact description of them suggests that Irish monks were navigating the North Atlantic long before the Vikings arrived, and that the tradition of Brendan's voyage was already old by his time. But the great written account, the text that would carry the story across all of medieval Europe, that would be copied in monasteries from Ireland to Germany to Italy, that would be read aloud in candlelit halls and whispered over by scholars and dreamed over by ordinary men and women. That text is the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the Voyage of Saint Brendan. It was likely composed around 900 AD, though some scholars believe it may be somewhat earlier. No one knows exactly who wrote it. It emerged, as so many of the great medieval texts did, from the quiet depths of monastic life, composed by someone who knew the sea, who knew scripture, who knew the older Irish stories of magical ocean voyages, and who had a gift for weaving all of these things together into something luminous and strange. And once it was written, it spread. Copies were made. Monks carried it from monastery to monastery, as they carried all precious texts. It was translated into multiple languages, into Old French, into Old English, into German, into Norse. By the height of the medieval period, it was one of the most widely read texts in all of Europe. Versions of it appeared in over 100 manuscripts, scattered from one end of the continent to the other. People loved this story. They loved it because it was a voyage into the unknown. They loved it because it was full of marvels, islands of birds and columns of crystal rising from the sea and an ocean that glowed. They loved it because at the center of it was a man of prayer, a man of steadiness, who faced each wonder with the same quiet faith. And perhaps they loved it because somewhere in it, somewhere beneath the marvels and the mystery, they sensed that it was true. Let that thought settle now, like sediment in still water. A story, spoken for generations across the green hills and grey coasts of Ireland, then carried by ship and sandal across the whole of medieval Europe, then committed to the patience of a monk's careful hand, pressed into vellum, bound between wooden boards, laid down in the darkness of a monastery chest to wait for you, in a way, all these centuries later. The world is very old, and very full of stories. And next, we will begin the voyage itself. We will follow Brendan down to the water's edge, and watch him build his boat, and set his face toward the open sea. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let your thoughts grow soft at the edges, and allow the image of that green, lamplit, rain-washed island to carry you gently, gently, toward sleep. We are continuing to the edge of the world, to that green, wind-touched, sea-bordered island at the far west of Europe, and we are going to watch a man make a decision that most people, even then, would have considered extraordinary. He is going to build a boat, and he is going to sail it west, into the open Atlantic, with nothing but faith and seamanship and the quiet confidence of someone who has prayed for a very long time about exactly this. Let us go and find him. By the time Brendan made his famous voyage, somewhere in the early decades of the 6th century, most likely around 530 AD, he was already a man of considerable standing in the Irish Church. He had spent years as a monk, as a teacher, as a builder of communities. He would go on, later in his life, to found the great monastery of Clonfert in County Galway, around 558 AD, a community that would become one of the most important centres of learning and spiritual life in all of early medieval Ireland. 4 centuries after his death, Clonfert would carry his name and his spirit, a place of scholarship and prayer set in the quiet Midlands of Ireland. But before Clonfert, before the years of building and leading and teaching, there was the sea. The Navigatio tells us that the impulse for the voyage came to Brendan through another monk, a man named Barinthus, who arrived one day at Brendan's community with extraordinary stories. Barinthus had sailed west, he said. He had found islands in the ocean, a land of promise, as he called it, a place of extraordinary beauty and light, where the air itself seemed to shimmer, where fruit hung heavy on trees, and where the quality of the light was unlike anything he had ever seen in Ireland or anywhere else. He had turned back eventually, because that is what one does when one has found a thing of wonder. One turns back, so that the wonder stays pure, so that it remains ahead of you, drawing you forward. Whether Barinthus was a real person, a symbolic figure, or some combination of both, the scholars cannot quite agree. But the function he serves in the story is clear and beautiful. He is the one who goes just far enough to bring back the news. He is the rumour of paradise. And Brendan, hearing his account, felt something stir in him, a certainty, deep and quiet, that he was meant to follow. So he began to prepare. The boat he built was a currach. Say that word slowly for a moment. Currach. It is a word from the Irish language, and it describes one of the oldest and most extraordinary types of watercraft ever devised by human hands. A currach is built, at its heart, from two things that Ireland has always had in abundance: wood and leather. The craftsman would first construct a wooden frame, a skeleton of the boat, shaped from ash or hazel rods, bent and lashed together into long, elegant curves. Then, over that frame, they would stretch ox hides. The hides were prepared carefully, tanned in oak bark to make them more durable, and then stitched together with leather thongs, tightly, patiently, stitch by stitch, until the covering was complete. Finally, the whole surface was sealed with fat, butter or animal tallow, worked into every seam, every stitch hole, every surface of the leather, until the boat was as watertight as careful hands could make it. The result was something that looked, to the uninitiated eye, impossibly fragile. A large, open boat of wood and skin, light enough to be carried by a small group of men, flexible enough that, when a wave struck it, the whole hull would give, would bend and yield, and then return to its shape, rather than cracking or splitting as a rigid wooden vessel might. And that flexibility was, it turned out, one of the currach's greatest strengths. The Atlantic Ocean does not offer calm seas. It offers long, rolling swells that build across thousands of miles of open water. It offers sudden storms and confused, choppy waves in the shallows. A boat that fights those waves will eventually lose. A boat that moves with them, that breathes with the sea, in a sense, can survive conditions that would destroy something stiffer and heavier. Irish fishermen and monks had been using currachs for centuries by Brendan's time. They knew these boats. They trusted them. And Brendan's currach, built for an ocean crossing, was simply a larger, more carefully made version of what his people had always used. There is something deeply moving about this, if you let yourself feel it. This man, preparing to cross the Atlantic Ocean, putting his trust not in iron or in timber planking, but in animal hide and wooden rods and hand-stitched seams. It is one of the most quietly audacious things in the history of exploration. He gathered a crew. The Navigatio tells us that Brendan chose 14 monks to accompany him. 14 men, all of them presumably experienced enough with the sea to understand what they were agreeing to, and all of them possessed of sufficient faith to agree to it anyway. They were monks, not sailors, though in the Ireland of that era, the distinction was less clear than it might seem. The monasteries of the Irish coast had long relationships with the sea. Monks travelled by water as readily as by land. Small communities of hermits lived on sea stacks and rocky islands, their monasteries clinging to cliff faces above crashing waves. The sea was not alien to these men. It was simply another form of the wilderness in which a person might encounter God. There is also a detail in some versions of the story that adds a quietly human touch. 3 additional monks, we are told, arrived at the last moment and begged to be taken along. Brendan is said to have looked at them for a long moment and then agreed, though he told them, with the gentle directness of a man who could read people, that the voyage would not end well for all of them. It is a strange, foreshadowing moment, and it reminds us that even the most sacred of journeys contains, within it, the full complexity of human nature. 17 men. Then, a leather boat. An ocean. The departure point, according to tradition, was Brandon Creek, on the Dingle Peninsula in County Kerry. If you have never been to Brandon Creek, it is worth knowing what it looks like. It is not a grand harbour. It is not a broad, sweeping bay from which a fleet might sail with ceremony and crowds watching from the shore. It is a narrow cleft in the rock, a deep, shadowed inlet where the cliff walls come close on either side, and the water below is dark and still compared to the open sea just beyond the entrance. There is room, barely, for a boat to be brought alongside the rock and loaded. The mountains rise steeply behind. The sky is a strip of grey-blue above. It is, in its way, the perfect departure point for a voyage like this. Something private about it. Something concentrated. As if the world narrows there to a single point, and beyond that point, beyond the cleft in the rock, beyond the first breaking of the swell, everything opens up into the immeasurable. Before they launched, Brendan and his monks prayed. They fasted. They asked for blessing on the boat, on the voyage, on themselves. This was not ceremony for its own sake. These were men for whom prayer was the most practical thing imaginable, the act by which you aligned yourself with the forces that govern the world and opened yourself to guidance. They would need guidance. The Atlantic in the 6th century was, to European eyes, essentially unknowable. There were rumors and stories, as there always are, but no maps, no certainty, only the open water and whatever lay within it. And then they pushed off from the rock, and the currach moved out through the narrow cleft, and the cliff walls fell away on either side, and the open sea opened before them like a held breath finally released. The first significant land they found, after sailing north through the waters between Ireland and Scotland, and then out into the broader North Atlantic, was a group of islands that the Navigatio describes with particular tenderness. There was an island of sheep, the text tells us. Wild sheep, white as snow, wandering unafraid across treeless green hillsides. And nearby, or perhaps the same island at a different season, a place so thick with birds that the noise of them was like the sound of a great choir, filling the air from shore to clifftop. The monks landed and gave thanks and rested. These descriptions, read carefully, match almost perfectly the Faroe Islands, that scattered group of rocky, treeless, windswept islands sitting in the North Atlantic roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland. The Faroe Islands are, to this day, extraordinary places for seabirds. Puffins and gannets and fulmars nest there in numbers that can seem almost incomprehensible. And wild sheep have grazed those hillsides for so long that no one is quite certain when they first arrived. But here is the thing that makes this more than just a poetic description. When the Norse settlers began arriving in the Faroe Islands in the 9th century, several hundred years after Brendan's time, they found something waiting for them. Not a wilderness. Not an empty shore. They found traces of people who had been there before them. The Norse themselves called these earlier inhabitants papa, their word for the Irish monks and hermits who had been quietly spreading across the North Atlantic long before the Vikings arrived. Dykwill, the Irish monk and geographer we met last night, specifically mentions the Faroe Islands in his writing. Irish monks had been living there, he says, for roughly 100 years before the Norse came and drove them away. They had gone there for the reason Irish monks went to all such places, for solitude, for the stripping away of comfort, for the particular closeness to God that seems to come when you are surrounded by nothing but water and sky and wind and the voices of birds. Brendan's monks were not the first Irish travellers to reach the Faroes, but they may well have been among the earliest. And the fact that later history confirms, absolutely and independently, that Irish monks were present in the North Atlantic long before any other Europeans is one of the pieces of evidence that gives the voyage of Brendan its stubborn, quiet credibility. This was not purely legend. Something happened out there on that ocean. something real. Let that thought carry you now, as your body grows heavier and your breath grows slower and the edges of the day soften and dissolve. 17 men in a leather boat, moving north through the grey-green Atlantic, the cliffs of Ireland falling behind them, the Faroe Islands ahead, those extraordinary, bird-loud, sheep-grazed hillsides rising from the sea like something dreamed. They prayed. They rowed when the wind failed them. They slept in turns, wrapped against the cold, the hull of the currach flexing gently beneath them with each long swell. Above them, when the clouds parted, an infinity of stars. And they kept going. Next we will follow them further, out past the familiar northern latitudes, into waters that even the most seasoned Irish monks had rarely seen. Into the deep Atlantic, toward the Azores, and beyond. Let the sound of that ocean settle around you, the long, slow rhythm of open water, the creak of a wooden frame, the soft give of leather beneath a wave. And let it carry you, gently, into sleep. We are continuing to the ocean now, to that small leather boat, moving through the deep Atlantic, 17 monks aboard, the Faroe Islands now behind them and the vast open sea ahead. The world they knew, the green hills of Ireland, the monasteries, the smell of rain on stone, has become a memory carried at the back of the mind, the way a candle flame carries in cupped hands. They are going further now, into waters that very few European eyes had ever seen. Let us go with them. South and west of the Faroe Islands, the North Atlantic opens up into something enormous. There are no landmarks, no coastlines, no shallow banks where the color of the water changes and the seabirds cluster and a sailor knows that land is near. There is only the long procession of swells, rolling in from the west with the patience of things that have been moving for 1,000 miles before they arrive. The sky and the water seem, in every direction, to be the same thing, grey-blue, immense, indifferent to the tiny vessel making its way across them. And yet Brendan's monks kept their heading, kept their prayers, kept their trust in the currach and in each other and in whatever force it was that they believed had called them to this journey. Somewhere in those southern waters, somewhere out in the broad, warm-tended Atlantic where the latitude drops and the air softens and the color of the ocean shifts from grey-green to something deeper and more blue, they would eventually have found land again. The Navigatio describes, at various points in the voyage, a series of islands where the monks stopped to rest and to worship. One of these islands, described as the home of a settled community of monks, a quiet, ordered, spiritual community that had been living there for generations, has long intrigued scholars. The description of it carries a warmth, a sense of arrival, that is different from the other island accounts. It feels like a place that is genuinely inhabited, genuinely welcoming. Many who have studied the geography of the voyage believe this island community may correspond to the Azores. The Azores. 9 islands, scattered across the mid-Atlantic, roughly 1,500 kilometers west of Portugal. Volcanic in origin, dramatic in landscape, mountains rising steeply from the sea, crater lakes of extraordinary stillness, coastlines of dark basalt against the deep blue of the ocean. They sit, these islands, almost exactly where you would expect a monk in a currach to find land, if he had sailed southwest from the Faroes with a reasonable wind at his back. The Portuguese are credited with the official European discovery of the Azores, in the early 15th century, nearly 1,000 years after Brendan's time. But when the Portuguese arrived, they found something curious. Among the islands, on Corvo, the most remote of them, there were signs that someone had been there before. Old ruins, markings in stone, suggestions of habitation that the Portuguese could not account for. There has been debate about this for centuries, and the evidence is not conclusive. But it sits alongside all the other pieces: the Irish monks in the Faroes, Dykewell's careful geography, the internal logic of the navigatio's route, and it adds to the picture of a North Atlantic that was not, in the early medieval period, quite as empty and unexplored as we have sometimes assumed. Irish monks were extraordinary travelers. Their faith drove them outward, into solitude, into the wild edges of the world. And the Azores, remote and beautiful and entirely surrounded by ocean, would have been exactly the kind of place such men might have sought out and quietly settled. One of the more fascinating aspects of the Navigatio is the way in which Brendan's voyage is structured, not just geographically, but spiritually. The monks, we are told, celebrated the great feasts of the Christian year at specific islands, returning, in some cases, to the same island year after year to observe Easter or Christmas. The voyage is described as lasting 7 years in total, with this cycle of liturgical celebration woven through it. This is unusual for a travel narrative. Most accounts of exploration are structured around discovery: the new place, the new site, the new coastline appearing over the horizon. But the Navigatio is structured, at least in part, around time. Around the rhythm of prayer and feast and fast that governed monastic life. What this suggests, quietly, is that for Brendan and his monks, the voyage itself was a form of worship. They were not simply crossing an ocean. They were living their faith across it, carrying their calendar, their prayers, their community of practice out onto the open water, allowing the journey to become a kind of extended monastery, without walls, without a fixed location, moving always westward. This is a beautiful idea, and it may also be, in a practical sense, a key to understanding how the voyage was navigated. If the monks returned to certain islands at certain seasons, year after year, they were building up knowledge of currents, of prevailing winds, of the behavior of the ocean at different times of year. They were becoming, over the 7 years of the voyage, extraordinarily skilled navigators of a particular stretch of the Atlantic. Not by instrument, by experience, and by attention. Further south and west, further into the deep Atlantic, into waters that grow warmer and stranger, the Navigatio offers one of its most haunting descriptions. The sea, the text tells us, became thick, sluggish. The water lost its clarity and its movement. The currach pushed through it with difficulty, as if the ocean itself had thickened into something between water and solid matter. The monks looked over the sides and saw, spreading in every direction as far as the eye could reach, vast mats of weed, tangled, golden brown, drifting in slow windrows across the surface of a sea that seemed barely to move. Any reader who knows the Atlantic will recognize this immediately. The Sargasso Sea. It is one of the most extraordinary places on Earth, a region of the North Atlantic, roughly the size of the United States, defined not by coastlines but by ocean currents. 4 great currents, the Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic Current, the Canary Current, and the North Atlantic Equatorial Current, circulate around it in a slow, permanent gyre, trapping within it a body of water that is uniquely calm, uniquely clear, and uniquely populated by a single extraordinary organism, the sargassum seaweed. Sargassum floats. Unlike almost all other seaweeds, it spends its entire life drifting at the surface, reproducing by fragmentation, accumulating over centuries into the vast, shifting meadows that give the Sargasso Sea its name. Seen from a small boat, pushing slowly through it, with the weed stretching away in every direction and the water beneath it dark and still and deep, it would be an experience of profound strangeness. To 6th-century monks, encountering it for the first time with no framework for understanding it, it must have seemed like the edge of the world made visible, as if the ocean were turning solid beneath them, as if they had sailed beyond the place where water behaves as water, and yet they kept going. It is at some point in the open ocean, the navigatio is not always precise about the sequence of events, that the voyage offers perhaps its most famous episode. The monks, exhausted from rowing, came upon what appeared to be a small island. A flat, dark, rocky surface, rising just slightly from the water, large enough to land on and to rest. They brought the currach alongside, climbed out, and, with the practicality of men who needed to eat, began to light a fire to cook their meal. And then the island moved. Slowly at first. A tremor beneath their feet. Then, with a long and deliberate shift, the entire surface began to sink and to move forward, carrying their fire and their cooking pots with it, until the monks scrambled back into the currach, hearts pounding, and watched the thing they had been standing on slide gently beneath the waves. It was not an island. It was a whale. The creature is named in the Navigatio, Jasconius, a word whose origins remain a little uncertain, though it may derive from an Irish word for fish. And the monks, once safely back in their boat, are described as understanding the encounter not as a disaster but as a wonder. As one more demonstration that the world is stranger and larger and more full of life than any human being can entirely account for. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because the whale episode is not unique to the story of Brendan. Similar tales appear in other medieval voyage literature, in Arabic and Norse and Byzantine texts, and some scholars believe they may reflect real encounters with basking whales, which do occasionally lie so still at the surface, in calm conditions, that they have reportedly been mistaken for low-lying land. Basking whales. Their dark backs awash. Their enormous stillness. Whether literal or symbolic, the whale named Jasconius is one of the most enduring images in the whole of the Navigatio, and it carries within it a quiet, important truth about the nature of the ocean, that what appears solid may be alive, that what appears still may be about to move, that the world, at its edges, does not always behave as we expect it to. And then there is the column of crystal. In one of the most visually spectacular passages in the entire Navigatio, the monks describe sailing toward a vast object rising from the sea. Translucent, they say, of a silver clarity, rising to a height that seemed almost impossible, higher than the eye could comfortably reach, with a canopy at its top that cast a wide shadow on the water. They sailed through an opening in it, an archway of sorts, and found the interior filled with a light that was not sunlight but something purer, something that seemed to come from within the structure itself. Scholars have debated this passage for a long time, but the most widely accepted interpretation, particularly among those who take the voyage seriously as a work of geographic observation, is that what Brendan's monks encountered was an iceberg. A large iceberg, seen from a small boat at close range, in the clear light of the North Atlantic, is genuinely unlike almost anything else in human experience. The scale of it is difficult to process. The color of it, that extraordinary blue-white translucency, the way the light moves through it, the sense that it is illuminated from within, is unlike the color of anything on land or sea. And the sound of it, as the water moves around it and through its caverns, is a sound that has no equivalent. To monks encountering one for the first time, with no category in which to place it, no word for it, no previous description to reach for, it would have seemed miraculous. It would have seemed like an intervention of the divine into the ordinary world. Which is, of course, precisely how the Navigatio describes it. What strikes me, returning to the Navigatio again and again, is not just the catalogue of wonders it contains. It is the quality of the man at the centre of them. Brendan, as the text presents him, is not a man of anxiety. He does not panic when the island moves. He does not despair in the thick weed of the Sargasso. He does not lose his nerve before the crystal column. He meets each new thing with the same quality of attention, the deep, unhurried attention of someone who has spent a great deal of his life in prayer, and who has learned, through that practice, to be present to what is actually happening rather than to what he fears might happen. This quality, this steadiness, is one of the reasons the Navigatio was so beloved in the medieval world. Readers who encountered it were not just reading about a voyage. They were encountering a model of how to be in the face of the unknown, how to keep going, how to maintain faith and presence when the ground literally shifts beneath your feet. It is a lesson that has not aged. Let it settle now, as your breath deepens and the room around you grows quieter in your awareness. A leather boat on an ocean of wonders. A column of crystal rising from the water, filled with a light that seems to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. A whale, patient and enormous, surfacing into the story and then sliding back into the deep. And at the center of it all, a man in prayer. Next we will go further still, south and west, into warmer water, toward islands that might just be the edges of a world that Brendan's Europe did not yet know existed. Let the ocean hold you. Let the slow rhythm of deep water carry you, down and gently down, into sleep. Settle in now. Let the day go completely. Whatever it held, whatever it asked of you, let it drift back, away from you, like something released on water. It has done its work. It is finished. And now there is only this. The quiet room, your own breathing, and the slow, warm, westward drift of an ocean that has been moving in the same direction, with the same patient power, for longer than any human civilization has existed. We are going to follow that ocean now. We are going to let it carry us, as it would have carried Brendan's small leather boat, toward the west. Toward warmth. Toward islands of extraordinary beauty, floating in water so clear you can see the bottom from the surface, in colors that have no exact name in any Northern European language. Come. There is a river in the ocean. This is not a metaphor. It is a fact, one of the most remarkable facts in all of physical geography, and it would have shaped the voyage of Brendan's currach as surely as any wind or any act of navigation. The Gulf Stream. It begins in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, pushing through the narrow passage between Florida and the Bahamas, and then sweeping northward and eastward along the coast of North America before turning out across the open Atlantic toward Europe. It is, in terms of volume, the largest current on Earth, carrying more water than all the world's rivers combined. And it is warm. Distinctly, noticeably warm. A band of blue water in an otherwise grey-green ocean, moving at a speed that a small boat could feel. A current that, if you were sailing in the right direction, would simply carry you. Brendan's monks, if they had made their way south and west from the Azores or the Sargasso Sea, pushed by the trade winds, guided perhaps by the flight patterns of birds, following the warming of the water and the changing color of the sky, would eventually have found themselves in the embrace of the Western Atlantic. And once there, the Gulf Stream would have become both their guide and their engine. It would have carried their currach northward along the American coast with a force and a warmth that would have seemed, to 6th century monks, like nothing so much as a gift. The ocean, helping them along. The Navigatio describes, in passages of particular beauty and intensity, the arrival of the monks at a great land. Not an island, this time. Something larger. A coastline that stretched away in both directions, that seemed to go on indefinitely, that was covered in trees and flowers and fruit of an extraordinary richness. The light there was different, the text says, clearer somehow, more even, as if the sun were closer or the air itself were purer. The monks walked inland for a time, through a landscape of overwhelming abundance, and found a great river that they could not cross, a river that seemed to mark the interior boundary of this place from something further and more mysterious beyond. And they turned back, not from fear, and not from defeat, but from a sense, described with careful reverence in the Navigatio, that this place was not yet for them, that they had been permitted to see it, to walk upon its shores, to breathe its extraordinary air, but that the fullness of it was being held in reserve for another time. This promised land of the saints, as the Navigatio calls it, is the most debated destination in the entire voyage. Where was it? What was it? Some scholars have argued for the Caribbean. The islands of the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, the chain of the Lesser Antilles, do possess an almost unreal quality of light and color. The water is of a translucency that is genuinely unlike anything in the North Atlantic. The vegetation is extravagant by any northern European standard. A monk from Kerry, stepping ashore on a Bahamian beach for the first time, would have had no adequate language for what he was looking at. He might very well have reached for the language of paradise. The Bahamas in particular repay attention here. They are not dramatic islands. They do not have great mountains or volcanoes. They are low and flat and ringed with beaches of sand so pale it is almost white, and the water around them moves through colors, turquoise, aquamarine, the deepest and most saturated blue, that seem almost artificially vivid. They sit on shallow limestone banks, and in the shallows the light plays on the sandy bottom in shifting patterns, and the fish move through it in shoals of silver and yellow and iridescent blue. From the sea, approaching in a small boat, they appear first as a low dark line on the horizon, and then gradually resolve into something greener and more welcoming. The smell of vegetation reaches you before you can clearly see the shore. And then the color of the water changes, from the deep blue of the open ocean to something lighter, warmer, almost glowing. Columbus, when he arrived in 1492, landed in the Bahamas. He wrote in his journal that he had never seen anything so beautiful in his life, that the trees were unlike any he had known, and the water was of a clarity he could not account for, and the whole place seemed to him like something from a dream. If Columbus felt this way, a man who had sailed the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, a seasoned navigator with a lifetime of coastlines behind him, then imagine what a 6th century Irish monk might have felt, stepping ashore for the first time. Further north along the coast, carried by the Gulf Stream, moving through shallowing water and changing skies, the Navigatio offers descriptions that align intriguingly with the coast of Florida. Florida is unlike anywhere else in North America. It is a long, flat peninsula, barely above sea level, fringed with mangroves and shallow estuaries and beaches of extraordinary whiteness. The light there is intense and even, a quality that has drawn painters and photographers for centuries, a light without the harsh shadows of higher latitudes, diffused by the humidity and the proximity of the water on both sides. At certain times of day, in certain conditions, It has a luminous quality that is genuinely hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it, as if the air itself were faintly lit from within. The Navigatio's description of a land of perpetual light, where day and night seem unusually equal, has led some scholars to connect this passage with the experience of sailing along Florida's coast at the latitude where the days and nights are most evenly balanced. It is a tentative connection, but it is not an unreasonable one. And then there is the river, the great river that the monks could not cross. The boundary of the innermost paradise has been interpreted in various ways. But Florida's east coast is indeed crossed by several significant rivers meeting the sea. The St. John's River, which runs north through the interior of the state before turning east to meet the Atlantic near what is now Jacksonville, is one of the few rivers in North America that flows northward. It is wide, deep, and remarkable. Encountered from a small boat at sea, entering through mangroves and marsh grass into a broad, slow-moving, brown-watered interior, it would have seemed like exactly such a boundary, a threshold, something beyond which the ordinary world ended and something else began. The Navigatio tells us that not all of the monks completed the voyage together. At certain islands along the way, in the warmer waters of the western Atlantic, some of the monks chose to remain. They were not abandoned. They were not lost. They made a choice, described in the text with a kind of quiet solemnity, to stay, to build their small communities in the places where Brendan's currach had brought them, to continue their lives of prayer in these new, far distant shores. This detail is easy to pass over, but it is worth pausing on. If Irish monks were indeed making their way across the Atlantic in the 6th century, even occasionally, even in small numbers, then the idea of small communities of them remaining behind, in the Azores, or the Bahamas, or along the Florida coast, is not as fantastical as it might first sound. Irish monks had already demonstrated, in the Faroe Islands and in Iceland, a willingness to establish themselves in extraordinarily remote places. They required very little. A sheltered cove, fresh water, enough land to grow a little food, and the silence necessary for prayer. The Norse sagas add an intriguing detail here. Several Icelandic sagas, written texts from the 12th and 13th centuries, drawing on much older oral traditions, contain references to a place called Greater Ireland, or Ireland the Great. It is described as a land lying far to the west, across the ocean. Some of the sagas are quite specific. Norse sailors who were blown off course found it. They found, living there, communities of people who had Irish customs and spoke a language related to Irish. The sagas are not consistent about where exactly Greater Ireland was located, but the most detailed accounts seem to place it somewhere on the eastern coast of North America. These references have been debated vigorously. They are not proof of anything, on their own. But they are there, in the written record, independent of the Navigatio, from a completely different cultural tradition, suggesting that the Norse, who were themselves remarkable Atlantic navigators, believed that Irish people had been in the western Atlantic long before them. The cumulative weight of all of this, the Navigatio, Dikewill, the Norse sagas, the archaeological traces in the Faroes and possibly the Azores, does not prove that Brendan crossed the Atlantic. But it does suggest, with some force, that the story did not emerge from nothing. And then, gradually, the voyage begins to turn. The warm islands lie behind them. The Gulf Stream, which had carried them north, is now something to navigate across rather than within. The water cools. The light changes. That particular quality of softness that the southern latitudes had given the air begins to harden into something cleaner and colder. the light of higher latitudes, the light of the open North Atlantic. The monks, in the Navigatio, do not express homesickness at this point. They express gratitude. They have seen what they came to see. They have been carried further than any of them had imagined. And now the long arc of the voyage begins its turn toward the north and east, back toward the familiar cold, back toward grey water and grey sky and the particular smell of the Irish coast on a westerly wind. But there is more to come before home. There is Iceland. There is a volcanic coastline that burns. There is a hermit on a rock in the middle of the ocean. And there is the long, cold, difficult, beautiful final passage home. Let us continue. Let the warmth of those western waters stay with you as you drift. The pale sand of the Bahamas, glowing faintly in the evening light. The translucent water, moving in slow, warm ripples over a sandy bottom. The smell of unknown flowers drifting from an unknown shore. The monks on their knees in the bow of the currach, hands folded, eyes closed, saying thank you in the only language they had for what they were looking at. And the Gulf Stream, beneath them, enormous and patient and warm, carrying them gently on. Let it carry you now too, into the soft dark of a night without edges, into the deep, unhurried quiet of sleep. Drifting, westward, and down. We are going north now. The warm waters of the western Atlantic are behind us. The pale beaches, the luminous shallows, the extravagant green of unknown shores, all of that lies to the south now, receding. The ocean around Brendan's currach is changing, deepening in color, cooling to the touch. And the sky above is doing something that only the sky at high latitudes does, holding the light long after the sun has gone below the horizon, as if the darkness is reluctant to arrive. This is the North Atlantic, and it has a different quality entirely from the warm south. It is a more demanding ocean, a more austere one, but it has its own beauty, vast, cold, ancient, and it will offer the monks some of the most extraordinary experiences of the entire voyage. Let us go with them. As the currach moved northward, back through the latitudes it had crossed on the outward journey, the character of the ocean changed in ways that were both gradual and unmistakable. The water temperature dropped. The color of the sea shifted from the deep tropical blue of the western Atlantic to something grayer and greener and more opaque, a color that carried within it the memory of cold, of depth, of the vast distances between this surface and whatever lay beneath it. The swells grew longer and more powerful, built by the uninterrupted fetch of wind across thousands of miles of open water. And the sky took on that particular luminous quality of the high North Atlantic, a light that is somehow both bright and melancholy at the same time, as if the sun is always at the edge of the horizon, always on the point of setting. And then, somewhere in the waters south and east of Newfoundland, the monks began to see things in the water that they had no category for. White shapes, pale and enormous, floating at the surface and below it, some the size of a house, some, the larger ones, so vast that their full extent could not be taken in at once from the deck of a small boat. The water around them was cold, colder than anything the monks had felt since the northern reaches of the voyage, and it had a particular clarity in the shadow of these white shapes, a blue-green translucency that showed the ice continuing downward into the dark, far deeper than the eye could follow. Icebergs. The waters off Newfoundland are known today as Iceberg Alley, one of the most iceberg-dense stretches of ocean on Earth. Every spring and summer, icebergs carve from the glacier of Greenland and drift south on the Labrador Current, moving in slow, stately procession through these waters before they melt in the warmer seas to the south. Some of them are enormous. The iceberg that sank the Titanic in 1912 came from this same cold conveyor belt, drifting south through these same latitudes. For Brendan's monks, encountering them for the first time, on a small leather boat, with no framework for understanding what they were looking at, the icebergs would have been among the most overwhelming experiences of the entire voyage. Not just their size, though the size alone would have been staggering, but their color, their sound, the deep, resonant cracking and groaning that a large iceberg makes as it moves and shifts and slowly dissolves. The way the light moves through the ice, that extraordinary blue-white translucency that makes a large berg look, in certain lights, as though it is lit from within. The Navigatio describes all of this, in its own language, reaching for the words available to a 6th century monk trying to convey something that had no precedent in any text he had ever read. The great pale columns, the caverns of ice, the supernatural quality of the light within them. And it is within one of these icebergs, or so the most evocative reading of the Navigatio suggests, that the monks had one of their most remarkable experiences. The text describes the monks sailing toward a vast structure of translucent material. We encountered this briefly in an earlier night, when we spoke of the crystal column, but here, in the northern waters, the encounter is more intimate and more enclosed. The monks are described as sailing through an opening in the structure, into a space within it, a cavern of sorts, roofed and walled with the same pale, luminous material, and finding themselves inside a quality of light that was unlike anything outside. Think of what it would actually be like to enter a large sea cave in an iceberg. The walls of glacial ice, ancient ice, compressed over centuries, are not white. They are blue. A deep, saturated, otherworldly blue that seems almost to glow in the darkness. The light that filters through the ice from above has a quality of purity, of stillness, of utter remove from the ordinary world. Sound is different in there. The lapping of the water against the ice walls. The distant groaning of the berg itself. Your own breathing. For a monk whose entire spiritual life was oriented toward the experience of transcendence, toward moments of encounter with something larger and purer and more permanent than the ordinary world, this would have been an overwhelming experience. Small wonder that the Navigatio reaches for the language of the miraculous to describe it. Small wonder that medieval readers, encountering this passage in a candlelit monastery, felt the hair rise on the back of their necks. From the icebergs, the currach moved on, northeast now, following the curve of the great ocean back toward the world the monks knew. And the next landfall brought them to a place that was, in its own way, even more extraordinary than the ice. Iceland. Iceland sits in the North Atlantic at the junction of the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates, and this geological accident gives it a character unlike almost any other place on Earth. It is, in the most literal possible sense, a land being made. The two plates are pulling apart beneath it, and the magma that rises through that spreading rift erupts continuously, through volcanoes, through geothermal vents, through geysers and hot springs and fissures in the earth that breathe sulphurous steam into the cold air. From the sea, approaching Iceland for the first time, the experience is deeply strange. The island appears on the horizon as a dark mass, lower than you expect. But as you draw closer, you may begin to see, depending on the season, depending on what the island's interior is doing, columns of smoke or steam rising from the land. Not the gentle smoke of a cooking fire. Something more massive. Something that has its own weather, its own cloud forming above it in the otherwise clear sky. And at certain seasons, and in certain conditions, you may see something more dramatic still. Fire. Iceland's volcanoes erupt with a regularity that no other inhabited place on Earth quite matches. The island has erupted, on average, once every 5 years throughout recorded history. Some of those eruptions have been modest, lava flows moving slowly across the interior. Others have been catastrophic, ash clouds that darken skies across Europe, lava fountains visible from the sea for dozens of miles. The Navigatio describes the monks' encounter with a volcanic coastline in terms of undisguised terror and wonder. The land, they say, was covered in smoke and flame. Great burning rocks were hurled into the sea from the cliffs, landing close enough to the currach that the heat was felt by the men aboard. The sea around the coast hissed where the lava met the water, and from the interior, a noise, deep, continuous, geological, that sounded like nothing so much as the interior of the earth itself, groaning. The theological interpretation that the Navigatio places on this encounter is the one that medieval readers would have found most immediately resonant. The monks believed, seeing that burning coast, that they were looking at the entrance to hell. Not as a metaphor, as a literal geographic fact. The medieval cosmology placed hell beneath the earth, a place of fire and smoke and bottomless depth, and here was a coastline that seemed to be exhaling it. The burning rocks, hurled into the sea. The steam rising where fire met water. The sound from below. It is a passage that must have sent a particular chill through its medieval readers. And it speaks to the remarkable honesty of the Navigatio that it does not sanitize the monks' fear. They were terrified. They rowed away as quickly as they could. And yet they had seen it. And having seen it, they could report it. We know, from completely independent historical evidence, that Irish monks, the Papa again, were living in Iceland before the Norse arrived in the 9th century. The Norse found them there, just as they had found them in the Faroes. And once again, the Papa departed, into the interior, or onto boats, heading further west into the ocean, rather than share their solitude with newcomers. The Irish were there, in Iceland, in the 9th century, which means they had been going there for some time before that, which means that Brendan's voyage to Iceland, or a voyage very like it, is, once again, not as improbable as the skeptical mind might initially assume. And then, somewhere in the broad ocean between Iceland and Ireland, in the middle of the North Atlantic, in waters where no sane navigator would choose to linger, the monks found something that stopped them entirely. A rock. Not an island. Not even a very large rock. A single, isolated pinnacle of stone, rising from the sea in the middle of nowhere, barely large enough to stand on, surrounded by water for hundreds of miles in every direction. And on that rock, impossibly, improbably, in a way that defied every practical consideration, a man was living. The Navigatio calls him Paul. Paul the hermit. And his story, as he tells it to Brendan and the monks, is one of the most quietly astonishing passages in the entire text. The rock is Rockall. If you look at a map of the North Atlantic and find Ireland, and then let your eye travel west and slightly north, past the outer Hebrides of Scotland, past the edge of the continental shelf where the shallow water drops away into the deep ocean, you will find it. A single dot on the map. So small that on most maps it doesn't appear at all. It is a granite pinnacle, roughly 20 meters high, rising sheer from the ocean floor in water that is 3 kilometers deep. There is no beach, no sheltered cove, no fresh water, no soil in which anything might grow. It is, by almost any measure, the most uninhabitable piece of land in the North Atlantic. And yet, Paul the hermit, as the Navigatio tells it, had been living there for 90 years. He had originally been a monk from a monastery in Ireland, from St. Patrick's community, the text says, who had been guided by an otter, of all creatures, to this rock in the middle of the ocean, and who had stayed. The otter, we are told, brought him fish. A spring of fresh water appeared miraculously from the rock itself. His clothes had long since worn away, but his hair and beard had grown so long and thick that they served in their place. He was, by any ordinary reckoning, a man who should not have been alive. And yet he was alive, peaceful, thin as winter, bright-eyed as a child, entirely content. This encounter, the meeting between Brendan and Paul on the impossible rock in the middle of the ocean, is the emotional and spiritual center of the Navigatio. Not the volcanic coastline, not the whale, not the crystal cavern, not the paradise islands of the West. This, because what Paul represents, in the theological imagination of the text, is the furthest possible point of the journey inward. He has gone as far from the world as a human being can go and still remain on earth. He has stripped everything away: community, comfort, warmth, food, clothing, the whole apparatus of ordinary life, and what remains, in the silence of that impossible rock, is something that the Navigatio presents as pure and clear and entirely without fear. Brendan looks at this man, this improbable, extraordinary man on his impossible rock, and recognizes in him something he has been moving toward for the entire voyage. Not a destination, not a place, a quality of presence, a quality of stillness, a life pared back to its essential core, and found to be sufficient. It is a deeply moving moment, and it is entirely in keeping with everything we know of the Irish monastic tradition, in which the most revered spiritual achievement was exactly this: the willingness to go to the edge of everything, to let go of everything, and to remain. The encounter with Paul marks a turning point in the voyage. After this deepest point, this furthest reach into the silence of the open ocean, the currach turns for home. Ireland is ahead of them now. The familiar grey-green water, the smell of land on the westerly wind, the cry of birds whose calls they recognize, and within Brendan, something that the Navigatio describes with great gentleness, not relief exactly, and not triumph. Something quieter than either, a completion, a sense that what was asked of him has been given, and that what was given has been received. The long voyage is almost over. Let that sense of completion settle into you now, as your breathing slows and the room around you grows softer and more distant. The impossible rock in the middle of the ocean, the old man on it, perfectly still, perfectly content, his long white hair moving in the Atlantic wind, and Brendan in his leather boat, watching him, understanding something for which there is no adequate word. Next we follow the currach home, through the final miles of ocean, back to the cliffs of Kerry, back to Brandon Creek and the smell of Irish rain. And then we will meet the man who, 14 centuries later, built his own currach and sailed it across the Atlantic to see if Brendan's voyage could actually have been done. Let the ocean hold you in its vast, cold, ancient arms. Let the stars come out above the water, and let yourself drift, gently, into the deep, dark, restful quiet of sleep. We are very close to home now. After 7 years at sea, 7 years of wonders and cold and warmth and ice and fire and impossible hermits on impossible rocks, Brendan's currach is turning east. The great arc of the voyage is completing itself. And somewhere ahead, still below the horizon but drawing closer with every stroke of every oar, are the cliffs of Kerry. And then, when we have followed Brendan safely home, we are going to meet someone else. A man from the 20th century, who read the Navigatio carefully and decided, with the particular determination of someone who takes an old story seriously, that he was going to find out whether any of it was actually possible. Come, let us sail for home. The Navigatio describes the final passage of the voyage with a tenderness that is different from the rest of the text. The great wonders are behind them now. The volcanic coastline, the icebergs, the whale, the warm western islands, the hermit on his rock, all of it receding into the past, settling into memory. The ocean the monks are crossing now is familiar in its bones, even if it is not yet familiar in its detail. They are back in the North Atlantic they know, the grey-green, long-swelling, cold-aired North Atlantic of the Irish coast and the Scottish islands. The light has that particular quality again, that clear, melancholy northern light that had been their whole sky before the voyage began. And then, one morning, the Navigatio does not specify the hour, but it feels like a morning, the smell changes. Any sailor who has been long at sea will tell you about the smell of land. It arrives before the land is visible, before the birds change, before the color of the water shifts. The smell arrives, vegetation, soil, the particular damp earthiness of a coastline after rain, and it reaches into something very deep in the human animal and says, home. The monks, we may imagine, lifted their heads, breathed it in, said nothing for a moment, and then, gradually, the cliffs appeared. The coast of Kerry is not a gentle coast. It does not ease you in gradually, through low sandy shores and shallow water. It announces itself, dark cliffs rising from the sea, the mountains behind them, the whole western face of Ireland presenting itself as something simultaneously forbidding and beautiful, like a face you love that has grown older while you were away. Brandon Creek would have appeared as it always had, that narrow cleft in the rock, the dark water between the cliff walls, the smell of the interior. The monks brought the currach in carefully, as they had brought it out 7 years before. They stepped ashore on Irish rock. They knelt, perhaps. They were quiet for a long time. The Navigatio does not dwell extensively on the homecoming. It has the restraint of a text that understands that some things are diminished by description. Brendan returned. He told what he had seen, and the world he returned to was not quite the same world he had left, not because it had changed, but because he had. Brendan lived for many years after the voyage. He continued to found monasteries, to teach, to build the communities that would carry the Irish Church forward into the centuries ahead. His great foundation at Clonfert in County Galway became one of the most important monastic centres in Ireland, a place of learning and prayer that outlasted him by centuries, and whose cathedral, much rebuilt over the centuries, still stands in the green Midlands of Galway today. The west doorway of Clonfert Cathedral, carved in the 12th century, is one of the masterpieces of Irish Romanesque architecture, a doorway surrounded by carved stone heads, row upon row of them, looking out with the same quiet, watchful expression. Brendan died around 577 AD, at Annadown in County Galway, at what the records suggest was the remarkable age of approximately 93 years. He was buried at Clonfert, and there he has remained, in the ground of the community he founded, while the centuries passed above him and his story continued to travel the world without him. He was canonized, declared a saint, and his feast day is the 16th of May. On that day, in Clonfert and in Kerry and in communities of Irish descent around the world, he is still remembered. The patron saint of sailors, among other things. which seems entirely right. Now, forward in time. A very long way forward. 14 centuries after Brendan pushed his currach out through the cleft of Brandon Creek and pointed its bow toward the open ocean, a man sat down with a copy of the Navigatio Sancti Brendani and read it with the careful, practical attention of someone who is trying to work out whether a thing could actually be done. His name was Tim Severin. He was born in 1940 in Assam, in India, to Irish parents, and he grew up to become one of the most remarkable explorers and travel writers of the 20th century, a man whose particular gift was the reenactment of historic voyages in historically accurate vessels. He had already retraced the journey of Marco Polo by motorcycle and the route of Sinbad the Sailor in an Arab dhow. He was a man who understood, in his bones, that the best way to test the truth of an old story was to live it. And now he turned his attention to Brendan. The question Severin wanted to answer was specific and practical. Not whether Brendan was a real person, that seemed reasonably established. Not whether the Navigatio was a historically accurate document, that was a more complex question than any single voyage could resolve. But whether the core claim of the story was physically possible. Could a currach, built with 6th century materials and methods, actually cross the North Atlantic? To find out, he needed a currach. The construction of what would become known as the Brendan, the name Severin gave his boat, was itself an extraordinary undertaking. Working with a traditional Irish currach builder named John O'Connell, and drawing on both the descriptions in the Navigatio and the surviving evidence of early medieval Irish boat building, Severin set out to build as accurate a replica as the available knowledge allowed. The frame was constructed from ash wood and oak, steam bent into the long, curved lines of a large ocean-going currach. 49 ox hides were sourced, tanned in oak bark in the traditional manner, a process that took months, and then hand-stitched together using nearly 5 kilometers of leather thong, drawn through holes made with a traditional awl. The entire outer surface was then treated with wool grease, lanolin, worked into every seam. No synthetic materials. No modern adhesives. No metal fastenings of a type unavailable in the 6th century. The result was a boat 36 feet long, larger than a traditional fishing currach, but within the range of what a monk planning an ocean crossing might have built, weighing, with its crew and supplies, several tons, but carrying all of that weight on a hull of oak-tanned ox hide stretched over a wooden skeleton. It looked extraordinary, and to the uninitiated eye, it looked impossible. In May of 1976, Tim Severin and his crew, 4 men in total, departed from Brandon Creek in County Kerry. Brandon Creek. The same narrow cleft in the same dark cliff from which, 14 centuries earlier, Brendan's monks had pushed their own leather boat into the Atlantic. Severin had chosen the route deliberately, not just as a romantic gesture, but because Brandon Creek's geography made practical sense for a westward Atlantic crossing. A boat departing from there in May, with the prevailing winds and the known Atlantic current patterns, would be naturally directed northward toward the Faroe Islands, and then along the stepping stone route of the North Atlantic, Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, before turning southwest toward the American coast. Which is, of course, precisely the route described in the Navigatio. The voyage took 2 sailing seasons. In the first season, 1976, Severin and his crew sailed from Brandon Creek to Iceland, through the Faroe Islands, as the Navigatio described, stopping at islands that matched the text descriptions with a closeness that Severin found quietly remarkable. The Brendan performed in the North Atlantic swells with a seaworthiness that surprised everyone who encountered her. She was wet, inevitably, in those seas, and cold, and the conditions were at times severe. But she did not fail. The leather hull flexed with the waves exactly as the currach's design intended, distributing the stress of the ocean across the whole structure rather than concentrating it at any single point. In Iceland, the crew wintered. And then, in the spring of 1977, they set out again, westward this time, into the open North Atlantic. The ice was the critical test. Severin had read the navigatio's descriptions of the icebergs carefully. He knew that the waters off Newfoundland were iceberg alley, and he knew that sailing a leather boat through iceberg-dense waters was not a theoretical exercise in historical research, it was a genuinely dangerous undertaking. Ice can move. Ice can carve unexpectedly. Ice can hole a boat that gets too close. But he also knew that if Brendan's monks had made this crossing, they had sailed through exactly these waters. The navigatio's descriptions were too specific, too geographically accurate, to have been invented by someone who had never been there. The Brendans sailed into the icebergs. And the icebergs were exactly as the navigatio described them. Vast, blue-white, lit from within by a quality of light that defied ordinary description. The sound of them, the groaning, the cracking, the deep submarine rumble of ice shifting in cold water, was precisely what a 6th-century monk might have reached for supernatural language to convey. And the leather hull held. Through the ice, through the cold, through the long swells of the Labrador Sea, the Brendan kept going. In June of 1977, after 2 sailing seasons covering roughly 4,500 miles of open Atlantic, Tim Severin and his crew arrived in Peckford Island, Newfoundland, on the eastern coast of Canada. They had crossed the Atlantic in a leather boat. Not in a straight line. Not in a modern vessel. In a hand-stitched oxhide currach, built with 6th-century methods, following a 6th-century route, in conditions that the North Atlantic makes available to everyone regardless of the century in which they are traveling. The conclusion Severin drew from the voyage was carefully stated. He was a scholar as well as an explorer, and he understood the limits of what his experiment could prove. He did not claim to have proven that Brendan crossed the Atlantic. What he had demonstrated, beyond reasonable doubt, was that the crossing was possible. That a currach of this type, built with these materials, was genuinely capable of surviving the North Atlantic in open ocean conditions. That the route described in the navigatio was geographically coherent and navigable. And that the specific details in the text, the icebergs, the volcanic coastline, the bird-rich northern islands, the dense weed of the mid-Atlantic, corresponded, with remarkable consistency, to real geographic features that a traveler on this route would actually encounter. The navigatio, Severin concluded, was not a work of pure fantasy. It was a text that contained real geographic knowledge, knowledge that could only have come from someone who had actually been there. Severin published his account of the voyage in 1978, in a book called The Brendan Voyage. It was translated into many languages, read around the world, and became one of the most influential works of modern exploration literature. It changed the conversation about the navigatio permanently, making it impossible for serious scholars to dismiss the story as mere medieval fantasy, and opening up the question of pre-Columbian Atlantic exploration in ways that are still being explored today. Let that settle now. The thought of those 2 voyages, separated by 14 centuries, tracing the same route across the same ocean in the same type of vessel. The leather hull flexing in the same Atlantic swells. The same icebergs rising from the same cold water. The same quality of light on the same northern sea. Time, collapsing into a single image. A currach. An ocean. The smell of oak-tanned leather and cold salt water. Next we come to the final segment of our story, the legacy of Brendan's voyage in literature and imagination, from the medieval poem of Benedict to Umberto Eco, and the question that the whole extraordinary story ultimately asks of us. Let the ocean carry you. Let the long Atlantic swells rock you gently in the dark. Let the sound of the water against a leather hull, soft, rhythmic, endlessly patient, carry you toward sleep. We have traveled a long way together in this story. We have sat with monks in the lamplight of early medieval Ireland. We have watched a leather boat being stitched together by careful hands. We have crossed the North Atlantic, through the Faroes and the icebergs and the volcanic coastline of Iceland, through the warm blue shallows of the Bahamas and the long, luminous coast of Florida, and back again, past the hermit on his impossible rock, to the cliffs of Kerry. Now we come to the end of the story, or rather, as you will see, to the place where the story opens out into something larger than itself. Because the voyage of Brendan did not end when the currach came home. In many ways, it was only beginning. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani was a Latin text, composed by and for the monasteries. It lived, for its first centuries, in the scriptoria, those quiet, cold rooms where monks spent their days bent over vellum, copying text by hand, one careful letter at a time. It was read by scholars and abbots and novices. It was debated and annotated and passed from community to community across the whole of medieval Europe. But at some point in the late 11th or early 12th century, the story crossed a threshold. It moved from Latin into the vernacular, into the living languages that ordinary people spoke. And in doing so, it entered a completely different world. The man responsible for this particular crossing was a Norman monk named Benedict. Around 1106 to 1121 AD, the scholars debate the precise date. Benedict composed a poem in Old French based on the Navigatio. He called it the Voyage de Saint Brendan, and he dedicated it to Matilda, the Queen Consort of Henry I of England, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland, a woman of considerable learning and cultural ambition who was working to bring the literary traditions of the continent into the English court. Benedict's poem was not a direct translation of the Latin text. It was an adaptation, shaped by the conventions of the emerging courtly literary tradition, polished for an aristocratic audience that wanted its wonders served with elegance and its spiritual lessons wrapped in beauty. The poem preserved the essential elements of the voyage, the currach, the islands, the whale, the ice, the hermit, but gave them a new music. The music of rhyme, of rhythm, of a literary form designed to be read aloud, in a great hall, to an audience seated around a fire. In this way, Brendan's voyage entered the mainstream of European literary culture. No longer just a monastic text, copied from scriptorium to scriptorium. Now a poem, recited in courts, carried in the memories of people who had never set foot in a monastery, spreading the story further and wider than the Latin original could ever have reached alone. The story spread in other ways too. In images, in maps. Medieval cartography, the art of making maps in the centuries before accurate geographic knowledge was available, was as much a work of imagination and theology as it was of measurement. Maps were not simply practical tools. They were pictures of the world as it was understood to be, including the parts of it that were known only through story and tradition and faith. And on those maps, from the 13th century onward, there appeared an island. It sat in the Atlantic, west of Ireland and Spain, sometimes north and sometimes south, shifting its position from map to map as if it were, appropriately enough, not quite fixed in place. It was labelled in various ways: Insula Sancti Brendani, the island of St. Brendan, or simply Brendan's Isle. It appeared on the Hereford Mappa Mundi, one of the greatest surviving medieval world maps, created around 1300 AD and now hanging in Hereford Cathedral in England. It appeared on the Catalan Atlas of 1375. It appeared on maps made in the 15th century, and, remarkably, it continued to appear on maps made after Columbus. After the Caribbean and the Americas had been added to European geography, cartographers continued to place St. Brendan's Isle somewhere in the Atlantic, as if they were not quite ready to let it go. The last known map to feature it was made in 1759. 1200 years after Brendan's voyage, cartographers were still leaving a place for it on the map of the world. Now, a different kind of story, from a different kind of writer, but connected, in ways that matter, to everything we have been exploring. In 1980, 2 years after Tim Severin published The Brendan Voyage, an Italian novelist and semiotician named Umberto Eco published his first novel. It was called Illinois Nome della Rosa, the name of the rose. You may know it. It was one of the most celebrated novels of the 20th century, a murder mystery set in a medieval Italian monastery in 1327, involving a labyrinthine library, forbidden manuscripts, and the slow unraveling of a secret that has been kept for centuries. At its heart is the manuscript culture of the medieval monastery, the scriptorium, the copying of texts, the preservation and sometimes the suppression of knowledge, the extraordinary power that a written text carries simply by virtue of surviving. Eco was a profound scholar of the medieval period, and he understood something that is easy to lose sight of in the modern world: that the texts we have from the medieval era are not the texts that existed. They are the survivors. For every manuscript that was copied and carried and preserved, many others were lost, to fire, to flood, to deliberate destruction, to simple neglect. The knowledge that reached us did so by accident as much as by intention, carried forward on the tide of human care and chance. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani was one of the survivors. It made it through. Over 100 manuscripts of it exist today, scattered across the libraries of Europe, in Dublin and Oxford and Paris and Rome and Vienna. Each one a copy of a copy of a copy, each one carrying within it the traces of the monk who made it. A correction here, a marginal note there, a slight variation in phrasing that tells you something about the community it came from. Eco never wrote directly about Brendan, but the name of the rose is, among other things, a meditation on what happens to knowledge as it travels through time, on the way stories change as they pass through hands, on the relationship between the literal and the symbolic, between what is written and what is meant. And in that sense, it speaks directly to the question at the heart of everything we have been exploring these past 7 nights. What is the Navigatio? Fact or legend? History or allegory? A sailor's log or a spiritual poem? Eco's answer, implied rather than stated, as the best answers always are, would be, why must it be only one of these things? The Norse, as we have noted, reached North America. We know this not just from the sagas but from archaeology. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist and Stein Ingstad, discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at a place called Lance Auxiliary Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. It was excavated carefully over the following years and confirmed beyond doubt, through radiocarbon dating, through the recovery of Norse artifacts, through the architecture of the buildings themselves, to be a genuine Norse settlement from around 1000 AD. The Norse were in North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and the Irish were in the North Atlantic before the Norse. This is not contested. The Papa, those quiet, sea-going Irish monks, were in the Faroe Islands and in Iceland before the Norse arrived. The Norse said so themselves, in their own written records. The question of whether any Irish monk ever made it as far as the American coast remains open. The archaeological evidence does not yet exist to settle it. But the trajectory is there. The capability was there. The tradition of outward-reaching, ocean-crossing, horizon-seeking Irish monasticism was there, fully formed, by the 6th century. And there is one more detail worth holding on to as we come toward the end. Columbus visited Iceland in 1477, 15 years before his famous voyage of 1492. He was there in the winter, and he would have heard, in Iceland, about the islands to the west. The Norse traditions of Vinland and the western lands were still alive in Icelandic memory in the 15th century. And he would almost certainly have heard, too, about the Irish, about the Papa, about their habit of sailing west into the ocean, about the traditions of islands beyond the horizon that the Irish had been carrying for centuries. Columbus, in other words, may have known about Brendan. Not by name, perhaps, but through the accumulated tradition of Atlantic knowledge that the Irish had been building one currach voyage at a time, since the 6th century. The admiral of the ocean sea, sailing west in 1492 with his 3 ships and his certainty that something was out there. He may have been, among other things, following a very old Irish rumour. Brendan is still remembered in Kerry, still present in the landscape in a way that 7 centuries of distance has not erased. Brandon Mountain, Cnoc Brinanin in Irish, rises to 952 metres on the Dingle Peninsula, the highest mountain in Ireland outside of Kerry's own MacGillicuddy's Reeks. It is named for him, and on its summit there are the remains of a small stone oratory, a tiny, ancient, roofless structure of stacked stone, where pilgrims have been coming for centuries. The mountain is still climbed on pilgrimage today, on the pattern day closest to his feast, the 16th of May. People come from Kerry and from further afield, walking the old paths up through the heather and the bog grass, past the streams and the stone walls, up into the wind and the cloud and the extraordinary view, on clear days, of the Atlantic stretching away to the west, all the way to the horizon, and beyond it. Standing on the summit of Brandon Mountain on a clear day, looking west, you can see exactly what Brendan saw. You can understand, with your body as well as your mind, why a man who had spent his life on that coastline might look at that ocean and feel called toward it. The horizon is not a wall. It is a threshold. And beyond it, as Brendan knew, and as Tim Severin demonstrated, and as the whole extraordinary tradition of the Irish peregrinatio insists, there is more world. Always more world. The concept that drove Brendan and monks like him has a name in the Irish monastic tradition. Peregrinatio pro Christo. Pilgrimage for Christ. It was not quite like the pilgrimage traditions of other cultures, which typically involved traveling to a specific sacred place and returning home. The Irish peregrinatio was something more radical than that. It was the deliberate abandonment of home, the casting off of the familiar, the comfortable, the known, in the pursuit of what lay beyond. It was a spiritual practice of displacement, of going out and not knowing where you would end up, and trusting that wherever you arrived was where you were meant to be. It is, when you think about it, one of the most demanding spiritual disciplines ever devised. It asks not just for courage, but for a particular quality of surrender, a willingness to not be in control of the outcome. To go to sea in a leather boat and trust the wind and the current and whatever force it is that moves beneath the surface of things. Brendan did this for 7 years. And in doing so, he became something more than a traveler, more than an explorer, more than a saint. He became a symbol of the possibility of going further than you think you can go, of surviving what you think cannot be survived, of finding, in the deepest and most remote places, something that answers the question you didn't quite know you were asking. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani has been in continuous circulation for over 1,000 years. It has been read in Latin and Old French and Old English and German and Norse and Italian and dozens of other languages. It has inspired poems and paintings and novels and voyages. It sits in the libraries of Europe, in its 100-odd manuscripts, patient and quiet, waiting for the next person who needs it. What does it offer that reader? What has it always offered? Perhaps this. The image of a man in a small boat on an enormous ocean, surrounded by wonders he does not fully understand, unable to turn back, uncertain what lies ahead, and yet, somehow, at peace. Not because he has resolved the uncertainty, but because he has chosen to be present to it, to stay in the boat, to keep going, to trust that the journey itself is the point. This is not a lesson that ages. In whatever century you read it, in a candlelit monastery in the 10th century, in a great hall in the 12th, in a modern library in the 21st, or in a quiet room late at night as your eyes grow heavy and the day recedes, the image speaks. The leather boat on the dark water, the monks at their prayers, the horizon ahead, holding its secrets, and at the prow, a man from Kerry, born near Tralee, raised by a wise abbess on the banks of the Meg, educated by a patient abbot in Galway, and drawn, by something he could neither explain nor ignore, to the edge of everything he knew, and then beyond it. Saint Brendan, navigator, monk, patron of sailors, keeper of the horizon. Let him go now, gently, back into the ocean that was his home. Let the currach move away from us, quietly, without hurry, across the dark water. The leather hull gleaming faintly in the last light. The monks' voices rising in evening prayer, carried back toward us on the wind, and then gone. The ocean receives them. The ocean has always received them. And now it is your turn to go somewhere. Not across the Atlantic. Not through icebergs or volcanic coastlines or warm western islands. Somewhere closer. Somewhere that requires no boat, no courage, no horizon. Just this. The weight of your body, growing heavier now. The breath, slower. The room, softer at its edges. The thoughts, losing their sharpness, becoming something more like weather, moving through, and passing on, and leaving a great, still silence behind them. Brendan crossed the ocean and came home. You are already home. And the only voyage left tonight is the one that takes you, gently, completely, without effort, down through the soft dark layers of rest, past the last edge of the day, and into sleep. Deep, quiet, restful sleep. Good night.